success really happens when you include the right people and ask the right questions. And I think that's what we talk about a lot in value analysis. And then when you achieve success in one small area, that success breeds success and it builds momentum. And I think we've seen that momentum happen as people come together to solve for very common problems, but very important problems that we experienced through the pandemic.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we are speaking with Rick Phillips, VP of Advisory Services at HealthTrust, and we are going to be talking about Rick's experience engaging end users. So not just physicians, but end users. He's got a clinical background himself. We're going to hear all about it in today's episode, Gary.
Yeah, Justin, looking forward to hear his insights and deliver to our end users some possible opportunities to move forward in their careers. And I think he's got a wealth of knowledge and represents quite a large organization, probably working across the country with lots of different key stakeholders. So looking forward to having Rick on the show today.
All right, we're going to be right back with Rick Phillips.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us for a conversation today around value analysis and specifically the focus on relationships is Rick Phillips, VP of Advisory Services at HealthTrust. And Rick, you and I had a chance to connect ahead of time for the interview, but also last season we spoke with a colleague of yours, Drew, and at the very end of that interview, we were talking about change management, and I think really effectively teed up this conversation for this season and talking about how important relationships are. So I'm excited to get into this conversation today, and I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Justin. Glad to be here. Thank you.
So, Rick, why don't we start with just a little bit of background on who you are, how you find yourself in this role with HealthTrust today?
Certainly. Well, quickly, I've been in healthcare for my entire career and love it. It's what I'm passionate about. It's what I can't imagine doing anything else. I started my career as a registered radiologic technologist and have board certifications in radiography, magnetic resonance, and computed tomography. I began at a level 1 trauma center. I liked the fast-paced environment. I really liked the critical thinking skills that it required. And during that time, as technology in healthcare really exploded, I became an MR scientist. And MRI was new to the healthcare market. So I worked with physicists and engineers to develop and optimize protocols, and also had the opportunity to do some application training for end users and also for physicians, because this was a new technology, new imaging modality for physicians. We were able to see the human body anatomically, functionally, and non-invasively in ways that we had not been able to in the past. Then as we launched that modality and spent a few years there, I worked in a lot of procedural areas, interventional radiology, surgical, the surgical environment, and cardiology in the cath lab. Then moved into operations, led several clinical areas, medical imaging, radiation oncology, surgical and perioperative services, laboratory, neurodiagnostics, and invasive and non-invasive cardiology. So really pulled from all those experience in operations roles. I had the opportunity to lead supply chain for a large IDN and also led service line operations for a large IDN. So that's sort of my background and what brought me to where I am today. And I think you pull on all those experiences that you've had in healthcare in the different roles that you have over time.
I love talking with people who have, educator experience, training experience, because to be effective in those roles, it really requires you to be able to message properly. And sometimes we have the right thing to say, but it doesn't get perceived the way that we wanted it to be perceived. And so I could see how you grew in those leadership roles, just because you were used to being in the weeds and trying to get everybody to understand a new technology and to train them. And I think, especially when you come on a podcast, it's just a skill set that's so valuable to when you're trying to share insights and information. And, we're going to be talking about value analysis, but I know we're going to put like this whole spin on it. And also something that you mentioned to me is you feel like value analysis has really gone through a transformation recently. So why don't we set the table for the conversation? I think everybody out there pretty much knows what value analysis is, but we want to speak to all different levels. So maybe you can even characterize it a little bit differently. Like, what does value analysis mean to you? And then you can talk some about the transformation that you think it's going under right now.
Certainly. As you say, there's a lot of academic and technical definitions of value analysis in healthcare and in other industries. But for me, I boil it down simply. You're a clinician. Justin, you've spent time clinically before, so you understand the 5 rights of medication administration.
I do.
I sort of apply that to value analysis. It's what I call the rights of value analysis. Is sourcing and procuring the right product for the right price at the right time, for the right application or the right end user for the right outcome or the desired or optimal outcome. So it's really that whole process and simply baking it down into those 5 rights and applying it in the same way that I would other rights that we use in healthcare.
So how do you think this has been changing? Like I always, whenever we talk about value analysis, I talk about how, especially in the early days when we were moving to that value-based purchasing model, all of a sudden, and this is when I left nursing, and then all of a sudden I was working as a sales representative for a company, I started noticing early, I guess, that I started going to these value analysis committee meetings, and there'd be like 30, 40 people at the table, and they'd all be peppering different questions. And some people would sort of have the baseline knowledge about what I was bringing to the table with my solution. And others were kind of probably shouldn't have been there, not because they didn't necessarily have some insights, but they weren't really going to be impacted that much. And yet they had a large voice at the table. And so I think just in terms of how quickly we need to move in healthcare, I think we learned a lot of lessons about getting the right people to the table. So does that play at all into how you see value analysis changing over the last several years?
I think so. I mean, many people, when you ask about value analysis, think it's focused simply on price, or that's the primary focus. But as I said, there are other components to value analysis. And you described a large number of people at the table. And I think for an effective committee, you have to have the right stakeholders. And depending on what you're evaluating or what you're considering, it's really pulling those right people together. And again, everything I consider relates back to healthcare experience. And again, you working in a clinical environment know that we rely on each other. We rely on a team. So everything's very team based. When you think of one of the more critical events in healthcare, it would be a respiratory or cardiac arrest. And what do you think of? The code team. It's a group of people that are focused on achieving a desired or optimal outcome. So I would apply that here. You pull the right team together and there's stakeholders who could have influence on that outcome. And the outcome, again, is finding the right product for the right application for the right outcome, and then ultimately for the right price.
Rick, I really appreciate what you said earlier too, and I'm going to tie back into what we're talking on the value analysis is you understand mission. You understand you've been in the boots on the ground. You understand the patient focused centered model. So in some previous episodes, we've had the question of who do I talk to? Where does it start? Where does it stop? Is it just at the executive level value analysis? You talked about the right key stakeholders, but maybe for our listeners that are listening, who are those people? What do they look like? How macro, how micro do we get on a value analysis team to really make it efficacious? And I ask that because, to Justin's point, it's evolved. I really think it's evolved, and you even said it too, Rick. So who can we really lean on to really make that happen? If you go a little bit more detail, Rick, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm always going to say, when you look at products, introducing products to the healthcare environment, supply chain is the front door. They're where we always start. That's always going to be my response. But when you look at once that new product or a product is introduced, there is the ability to research. There should be a team that researches the evidence to determine, is there a similar product? Is there a product that we should compare this to? And then, to your question of pulling together the right team, it always starts with having executive sponsorship or executive leaders. So you've got representation from your executives on the team. There will always be, because most of the products that we consider are clinical in nature, so you want nursing or clinical leadership. If it is a product that's used in the perioperative services environment, you want someone from surgical services represented. You obviously want your supply chain leadership there. If it's a subspecialty product that's going to be used by a specialist physician, you would want those specialty physicians represented on that committee, or that specialty service line leader. One of the key stakeholders, I believe, should be at the table at most of these conversations is infection prevention. If you have infection preventionists represented, there's always a component of many products that they need to weigh in on, because it can have downstream impact on care that's delivered if the right decision is not made on the front end. And then I think sometimes, depending on the product, there is an IT component to it. We sometimes forget that. That's specifically important. If it's technology, you want to make sure that IT is there to understand how that product can interact and integrate across the enterprise. And then certainly you want to have your data analyst and someone from the finance team represented.
And what about compliance and risk management? Did you mention that?
I didn't, but that's a good point. Risk is usually at the table, or someone that is from the quality department. When you especially look at products that may need to be researched for recall, risk management is important. And I think that's part of sometimes what I call the pre-work, where you do the evidence-based research to determine efficacy of the product and any potential risks of the product. So that's really teed up for the value analysis team.
So in the sales world, I noticed this, when I was a clinician, I knew I was a decision maker in some aspects, right? Like within any organization, I didn't necessarily make decisions around products, but I was often put in leadership positions in the department, and I made a lot of decisions about staff assignments and things like that. And I realize even now, being an entrepreneur, one of the things that a business needs more than anything is people who are willing to make decisions, because it's when you don't make decisions that things get hung up. But as soon as I became a salesperson, this whole concept of decision maker, like all of a sudden became really evident to me, because it's part of the sales process, right? Hey, find out who the decision maker is. And it's not always really clear to the vendor. But I also think, and having worked with a lot of people, I'm not so sure it's clear internally either. I don't think always people know who's making the decision. And what's great about the value analysis process is it brings all the people together that have kind of the key, like, involvement in any kind of a change, and they can provide the right level of feedback. And I think in most cases, supply chain is the decision maker to some extent, but there's a lot of other people making decisions. When you look at, maybe a small sourcing engagement to a really big opportunity, how do you identify decision makers, and, who are they? And maybe somebody out there is listening and they work in supply chain. They don't even realize they're a decision maker just because they're not the VP of supply chain, right? And so how do you identify them, and how have they changed how they make their decisions over time?
Well, I think classically, if you're looking at it from the supplier or vendor, as you described it, perspective, the front door will always be through the supply chain team, but it's those who influence or inform those decisions that you don't always see. And that oftentimes is the value analysis team, it's the clinical end user, It's those who really determine how the product will be used, how it will impact outcomes, and is it available when we need it? Because I think we've learned through the pandemic that the supply disruption that we have seen through the raw material challenges that we've seen, we've had to move further up the supply chain. Classically in healthcare, we're looking at the availability to procure the product and distribute the product, right? That's what has classically been our role in the supply chain. Not that we haven't looked upstream before, but when you have the challenges that we've experienced in this peri-pandemic environment, it's become more important that we look more upstream of the supply chain. We look at raw material availability. We look at where those raw materials are produced. We look at the ability of those manufacturers to access those raw materials. We look at shipping. We look at challenges in the shipping and freight environment today. So I think there's a lot of components that now influence our decisions that maybe were important before, but didn't seem as critical because they hadn't had an acute impact on us.
Rick, you brought up a really good point, and I don't know if myself or Justin or any of these people with the vendors and our manufacturers and our distributors have like just flowed naturally in these conversations, but it seems like we have to proactively ask that question now. Like a capital piece of equipment, some type of thing that's OTO, to your point. Is there a delay? Could there be a delay? And we're like, your whole upstream conversation just makes me think of how much are our end users really, really thinking about asking those questions of the vendors and really having the contingency plans if they're planning for a major expansion or getting materials or getting that scope or getting whatever they need for that surgeon coming in. Are we not asking the question now? Do we have to have a whole set of just checking the box to make sure Pandora's box, Murphy's Law aren't popping up?
I think we do. We've applied more resources to that, Gary, than we ever have. When you look at our typical contracting language, we all have failure supply language in those agreements. The end user didn't know about that. Frankly, the nurse at the bedside may not have cared about that. They just knew they got the product they needed when they needed it. When we were in the throes of the pandemic, they were worried about having the PPE, the gloves, the masks they needed for the next shift. So you have people throughout the entire continuum asking those questions now when that was never a question that was asked before, because it was just always there. Products were there when they needed them, and there was an abundance of them. So we see stockpiling of products now. When we look at a new product, those are questions that end users didn't ask before that you see them asking now. Well, where do you get raw materials for this product? Where do they come from? Are they in this country? Are you manufacturing stateside, or is it near shore, or is it out of the country? And if so, where? And all the geopolitical factors that we're all aware of, if you watch the news, those end users are influenced by those events as well. So they're asking questions that we've never asked or seen asked before. They may be asked by our contracting team, or they may be asked by people who are responsible for sourcing and contracting, but we're having bedside nurses ask those questions now, or bedside caregivers. Our surgeons, our physicians are more aware of the impact that availability of supply has had on their practice and ability to take care of their patients. So I think there is more resources, more time, more attention, more focus, and more people asking those questions now than I've ever seen in my career.
I definitely want to talk about that end user and that physician, like increased awareness part. But I'm also thinking back to an interview we did with Abe Saloom, which was really taking that supplier perspective and the fact that, hey, suppliers have suppliers. And I'd say different organizations have more visibility and sophistication in how they even know the answers to those kinds of questions that are now being asked. So as much as we talk about physicians and end users becoming more aware about availability of products and items, I would say also, as we start to dig a little bit deeper with our supplier partners, we're starting to realize that, and I think the suppliers are realizing that level of understanding and awareness and sophistication, is starting to come out, and it is becoming part of that decision-making process all the way down. Going back to the end user engagement, because of this increased awareness. Another thing I think about all the time is when I worked as a nurse, like we're notorious for hoarding supplies that we think we might not be able to have. And so, the risk of being overstocked on items and expired product, et cetera, like popping up out of the woodwork is definitely, kind of a concern too. And I think we probably didn't care about it as much as clinicians, but maybe now we do care about it. But does that also lead to more hoarding behavior? It's really a delicate balance. So can we talk about what it was like to get the attention of the end users and the physicians in the past and kind of like where we're at now?
Certainly. And I think that we talk about relationships, and I think if anything, the pandemic brought everyone closer to a common goal, specifically in healthcare. I mean, I think it brought the country together, but in the healthcare space, it certainly brought us together in a more meaningful way. When we were having to sequester product, we were having to allocate supplies. There was no hoarding because the end users and the clinicians knew that their colleagues needed those supplies as well. So I think that taught us to be more collaborative, not that we weren't already, because again, I think that most everything we do in healthcare is based on a team approach. No one person can solve the problem, and success really happens when you include the right people and ask the right questions. And I think that's what we talk about a lot in value analysis. And then when you achieve success in one small area, that success breeds success and it builds momentum. And I think we've seen that momentum happen as people come together to solve for very common problems, but very important problems that we experienced through the pandemic. So those value analysis skills were really important because you wanted to provide the right product at the right time to the right end user. But frankly, we were challenged to do that, right? I mean, we were changing policies in ways that I had never seen policies change. We were having to change processes on the fly. So I was talking to some nurse leaders who said we didn't even have time to push those policies out. So we put big whiteboards by the time clock so that we could notify staff as they entered the building, these are the changes for the day. None of us have seen that in healthcare because we're a pretty standardized evidence-based organization. But when you don't have evidence or you don't have the knowledge, you have to make critical decisions on the fly and understand the impact of those decisions. So it was really fascinating, interesting, and inspiring to watch as those people pull together to make those decisions. And again, I say it's about teamwork, and I believe that wholeheartedly and always will, because these decisions aren't made in silos. We don't solve problems in a silo, and we pull people together. Again, you pull the right people together, ask the right questions, you usually can come up with the right answer.
Rick, you're making me think about inventory controls, where maybe 3 years ago, we were trying to clean it up so much. Open the drawer, open the cabinet. Let's get it all out so we truly understand our inventory controls, our min-max levels, really get an accurate count, where we were trying to push that all out. And then the pandemic came back in. And I think that morphed back in where it needed to be, where the end user knew they needed to be. And so that's kind of shifted a little bit. And then the inclusivity, right? You talked about policies and procedures and SOPs. We don't have time to make that perfect, but we're trying to incorporate everybody. I see all of this like slowing it down. Like I could feel like a frustration of a nurse or an OR in a cath lab or in the surgery department. Like, do we need to do all this? So, because it slowed everything down. It's the right thing to do, but at the same time, like, we're trying to get things done. So how do we balance that, to really lay that out? Have we learned and we're moving forward? Do you see us just being more prepared on a 3 to 5 year plan? Where is it going, and how do you negate some of that frustration of like, it's the right thing? I'm in 100% agreement, pulling everybody together. But at the same time, it's like, this is too cumbersome. This takes way too much time. We're just a critical access hospital. We got to get it done. What are your thoughts on that, Rick, just for our end users thinking about it?
We've always had the ability to be agile and flex because you have to be. Healthcare is not an environment where you always have the time to overanalyze the situation. You have to make quick decisions based on experience and based on input of the team to intervene to achieve desired outcome. I believe what we experienced during the pandemic accelerated that in many ways. It also taught us that we did not have to suffer from complete analysis paralysis in some spaces, and we had the ability to make informed decisions in a very rapid way to yield a desired outcome. So I hope, and my desire is that we not go back to being bogged down in that decision making. We saw products that were being approved very quickly through EUA. We saw, as we described, policies being changed. Another example of something that we saw really accelerate that I don't believe will ever go back to pre-pandemic state is the acceleration of telemedicine and the ability to bring care to patients where they are. So I think that's one small example, maybe not in the supply space, but where we in healthcare have changed the way we deliver care and we deliver access to care in ways that we haven't done before. We got bogged down. There was a lot of regulatory hurdles that we had to jump. Those were removed during the pandemic. And I think we've learned we're not going to go back to that space. We're not going to go back to and I don't think we ever will. We talk about that often here. We talk about that with healthcare systems around the country. We talk about current state because I don't think we'll ever be in the space where we were pre-pandemic in a lot of ways. I mean, we talk about it with our labor force. We talk about it with service delivery. We talk about it with product availability. And I think we look at healthcare through a different lens today.
We had a great interview with Kristen Miles talking about hospital at home, just to piggyback off your point about changing the way we even deliver care and, minimizing the infection risk of coming into an acute setting too, right? Because of the way that the reimbursement model has changed. But to your point about telemedicine, we really escalated that out of necessity. But I think it has some real positive implications if we had made those moves prior to the pandemic. And I've definitely seen more and more sort of solutions starting to come forward with this concept of hospital at home. Managing the acuity is obviously a big part of that conversation. But the other thing I kind of wonder too, and I don't know that it has anything to do with engaging the end users, but negotiating leverage. Now that hospitals are talking about negative operating margins, and yet at the same time, suppliers are talking about increased costs of supplies due to the supply and demand and raw materials, everything we just talked about. How has negotiating leverage shifted in this environment?
I think it certainly has shifted. And we talked about that earlier, Justin. We had leverage of scale. We had leverage in the past of bringing, and it was leverage that really rewarded both the supplier and the purchaser, because if you could commit a large volume to a supplier, that would drive cost out for them and ultimately lower costs for the purchaser. As their costs have increased, it's had a big impact on the purchaser. So in absence of that leverage, you do have to rely on those relationships and an understanding that the impact of those increases have a negative impact on the operation of the hospital. So I think it's definitely shifted because suppliers now have challenges with raw materials that were not considered in the way they're having to be considered today. They're looking at products being manufactured more onshore or nearshore, at least for U.S.-based hospitals. At HealthTrust, we're manufacturing product, and we haven't done that in the past. So it's really looking forward to how do we solve for future need. But your question around leverage, I believe that it certainly has shifted. I wonder sometimes if there's leverage at all on either side. We just have to react to the environment that we're in, and we have to try to come to a common ground to solve problems to keep our health system solvent and keep our caregivers with products they need to take care of our patients.
Hey, Rick, I know we're getting close to the end of the time, so I'm trying not to go too deep in the weeds, but I do want for the end users to hear a little bit more about some of your best practices, even from your perspective, maybe we haven't addressed. I know you've talked about the right people at the table. You've talked about your value analysis team, being able to pivot and morph, but you have a wealth of experience, and I don't want to miss anything that we haven't talked about already. So really just kind of open-ended, what are some best practices that you've seen or you want to make sure that our podcast audience is able to hear from you?
I think a best practice for me, and I try to keep everything very simple and consider how we make decisions in healthcare. I think we always look to the evidence. And if you make evidence-based decisions and you make product selection based on the evidence, and the word standardization in healthcare can be seen as an ugly word sometimes. I embrace standardization because to me, standardization means that you've brought the right people together to evaluate a product or a process, and you've determined what's the right product or the right way to do this. And then we're all going to do it that way. So I think if you look at standardization and you look at product evaluation and product selection through that lens, and I think sharing data, we have been guilty in the past in not bringing the right people to the table. There may be people who are not end users of a product who are making the decision about product selection. And again, I see that in the more distant past. We've gotten much better about engaging those stakeholders. And again, depending on the product or product category, that stakeholder group may change. And you have to have the ability to flex, and you have to have the ability to bring the right people to the table, because as Justin said, if you have a static group that doesn't change, you're not making the best decisions. You're not having the right stakeholders to inform those decisions. So I think the ability to pivot, the ability to flex, the ability to bring in the right specialist at the right time for the right product categories is important and is a best practice. We talked from the beginning of this discussion around relationships. Every relationship, whether it's personal or professional, is built on trust. And I think if you continue to do the right thing and deliver the right product, you will build trust with those end users. I think engaging the physicians, engaging the clinicians that use the product, sharing the data with them, sharing the evidence. It's not hidden. We're very transparent in our processes. We show financial data. We show clinical evidence. We have a research team who look at products and comparative products. We even have the ability to look at product experience with that product in other countries because it may have been used there longer than it's been approved by the FDA to be used in the United States. So bring all that evidence together, determine by category who are the right people to inform the decision. And for me, that's a best practice. And it's really the same when you're pulling in a new product, right? Because you want a very standard process that you apply to reduce the overall cost of the product while maintaining your outcome driven, patient centered care. So that's that you look at new product introduction through that same lens.
Yeah, Rick, I really appreciate what you said there too about not allowing the group to be static. Because another thing that you'll see, and it's really just human nature, but the personality dynamics that come into play. When it's the same people coming in to the same meeting over and over, I mean, we all just kind of work ourselves into certain roles. I mean, I'm not even necessarily saying personality conflicts. I'm just saying personality dynamics that, some voices, whether they're upset about it or not, get muted in certain groups, and, really making sure that everybody that's there provides value. If you have a group that's always the same, everybody just sort of says, this is the way these meetings go. And I just think there's such an opportunity to also engage people by having that shift a little bit. And, you still always have to have the right people, and some of those groups are going to be similar. But do you have any best practices around that kind of piggybacks off of the human nature function of just, falling into a familiar role on some of these teams when you could be providing more value?
We do. And as we say, it takes a village, right? You have to have the right people in the right room for to yield the right results. I think establishing ground rules, and we often do that at the start of all of our meetings. You enter the room with humility. Everyone has to check their ego at the door because you come in with maybe a bias or a preference. So let's drop that when we walk into the room. Be very open-minded. We want your passion And we want your compassion to understand how your decisions impact others. We're coming together to solve problems. So the ability to work together. We have to have the ability to acknowledge our mistakes because we will make them. And again, bring your experience, bring your knowledge, and bring your diverse skill set to the discussion. And I think setting those ground rules and repeating those ground rules and reminding the participants of those ground rules is key, because to your point, you have those in leadership roles and those in assumed leadership roles. But again, it's really about the humility of being objective and bringing your experience to the conversation to inform the decision and outcome.
All right, Rick. Well, this has been a phenomenal interview, and you and Drew both provided some really great insights. I just want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you, Justin, Gary. Thank you for having us.
That was Rick Phillips, VP of Advisory Services at Health Trust. And right there at the end, Gary, I thought it was really important to just emphasize, if you are, in these meetings, you do have a diverse or different perspective or experience, or even an impact as you're making potentially a change and you're evaluating an opportunity to work with a new supplier or vendor partner, you have to make sure that you contribute. And I also can really appreciate what Rick said about the humility piece. And I will say, I think the last 3 years have been pretty humbling for a lot of people, just trying to keep up with the workload and whatnot. So trusting others on the team to have valuable input, getting the right people, and then laying down those ground rules so that the meetings can be productive, so critical.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. He said a couple of things that are just key takeaways. I think walking in the room, having these meetings, you got difficult meetings, have your passion, but share it with compassion. He said that I thought was a really, really good takeaway. And the other piece that I have heard many, many, many times, but I think it's really good for us to hear it, is check your ego at the door. This is a safe room. We're going to make mistakes. We're just got to flow with it and really be a team effort. I really like his comments at the end. I think there's some really, really good takeaways. So really, really enjoyed Rick and having him on the podcast today.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode, but there's many more to come. We hope you enjoy it. And if you do enjoy what we're doing here, we'd love to hear from you, especially on social media. We post these shows on LinkedIn and Facebook. Your comments, engaging with us. If you learned something during the episode, or maybe you have something to add that we didn't cover, would love to see that in the comments section on our social media posts. We'll be able to engage. You can also connect with Hayes, Gary, or myself by sending us a LinkedIn message there, or you can send the show an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We're on all of the major podcast platforms like iHeartRadio and Spotify, or Google and Amazon podcasts. But I would encourage you to consider downloading the Power Supply smartphone app. It's available on iPhone and Android. Sometimes we have bonus content like the back order process that Susie Collins shared with us a couple years ago, as well as we have articles on the go and other kinds of categories of content that we're putting out in audio form. So would love it if you downloaded the app and gave us a rating and a review while you're there. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, just want to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Power Supply.